Good evening, ethics class. How are you? So hopefully you guys got the email that I sent out yesterday concerning the progression of the rest of our course. If you didn't see that, definitely take a look at it. Also, writing assignment number 2 is posted, the shorter version. So I hope you all appreciate that. So make sure you look at those writing assignment guidelines, and please let me know if you have any questions. So this today is the lecture for the reading that I assigned last week. So we're going to talk about Chapter 11, the ethics of punishment and corrections. So I don't want to belabor the point here at all. It seems as if I lost my clicker. It's like we're in the classroom. I'll be able to track it down here. I hope I found it. I just did a lecture for my juvenile delinquency class, and I wanted it to be shorter. So I don't want to take too much of your guys' time. So I'm going to try to keep this as quick, short, and parsimonious as possible. So let's go ahead and let's get into it. So we are now in the correction chapters, and so this chapter begins by drawing a distinction between punishment and treatment. Now I have no doubt that we're all probably on top of the difference between punishment and treatment. I don't think I need to draw any firm lines in the sand on that. However, do keep in mind there really is no widely accepted definition of punishment. The one that I'm more preferential to is the one that appears very last on our PowerPoint, and it goes something to the effect of suffering purposefully inflicted by the state because one of its laws was violated. And so this chapter essentially talks about our 4 to 5 different kind of sentencing ideologies or sentencing philosophies, or kind of the reasons why we punish and sentence people. And then it talks about different types of sentences or punishments. And so, why exactly do we incarcerate people? What about capital punishment? What about Supermax prisons? What about private prisons? And then the chapter ends by kind of giving us a brief introduction into the correctional officer subculture. So let's go ahead and get into these different sentencing ideologies. So if you are following along with me on the PowerPoint, I am on the slide of correctional goals. So if you can remember back to Chapter 3, and that was the chapter where I drew the graph for you guys on the whiteboard. That was our chapter on justice. I told you when we got to the end of that graph that we would actually pick this back up, and sure enough, here we are, and we are picking that type of stuff back up. So essentially, we've got kind of 2 different camps concerning kind of why we punish. So we sort of have the retribution / just desserts camp, and we also have our utilitarian camp. Now in the retribution / just desserts camp, we talk about how that philosophy is essentially backwards looking. So we are punishing a person because they violated the law, because they broke the social contract, because they deserve to be punished. And as Kant said, we would essentially be doing that person a wrong if we did not punish them. And so we're not punishing them in order to deter them or in order to rehabilitate them. We are strictly punishing them just because they deserve it. So one of my favorite bands is a band that many of you probably haven't heard of. They were popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they are named Third Eye Blind. I have a signed record of theirs. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's this white one right there. Anyway, they have a popular song that came out with their album in 1997, and it's called Jumper. And they have a famous phrase in that song, And the famous phrase is, we should put the past away. And that is essentially the philosophy behind the utilitarian punishments. So they are forward-looking, right? They are putting the past away. So according to the utilitarian philosophies, we're not punishing someone because they deserve it. We're punishing this person because we don't want them to commit a crime again. Now, we have different philosophies about how we can actually accomplish that goal that fall under utilitarianism. So our first and most prominent one is not retribution, is deterrence, right? So we can put someone in a prison, we can fine someone, and then when they get out, or after they pay that fine, that will have been such a miserable experience that they will think twice before they commit that crime again. And we have our kind of two different types of deterrence, right? We have specific deterrence, and so that one focuses specifically on the individual, right? And we also have general deterrence. And so the example that I always give is, so somebody's driving home from work or from school and they get a DUI. So they have to pay a fine. They're probably going to spend a night or two in jail, possibly. They're definitely going to get their license suspended, right? And they could even spend a longer time in a jail as well. And so once somebody goes through that process, they get out, they have a few too many beers, and then they go to get behind the wheel and they say, no, I'm not going to do it, because you know why? Because my license got suspended, because I had to pay a fine, I now have a misdemeanor on my record, and I do not want to go through that again. You get a speeding ticket, you go to speed again, you say, oh, I had to pay that $100 fine, my insurance rates went up, I don't want to have to go through that again, so I'm not going to speed anymore. So that is specific deterrence. Now, general deterrence is other people being deterred because they see the punishment that somebody else goes through. So you're the one who gets the DUI, you come to class and you tell us about it, you tell us how the police officer was mean to you, how they had to do a forced blood draw on you, how your license is now suspended, how you had to spend a night in jail, and maybe you got sentenced to a few weeks in jail because of your DUI. We all hear that miserable experience you went through, and the next time we have a few too many beers, we think, oh, I remember what Jason went through, and I don't want to have to go through that, so I'm not going to drive DUI. So I learned my lesson because of Jason, right? And right as the whole Corona stuff was going down, I actually saw Jason. Funny story. I was driving to Walmart, probably to buy toilet paper or paper towels, because those were quite the hot commodity then. And so I'm driving to Walmart, sitting at a stop sign, and who do I see driving a convertible, looking all badass? Yes, it was Jason. So anyway, another one of our utilitarian philosophies is incapacitation. Now, if you remember when we talked about this in Chapter 3, I believe I drew you a graph on the board, and it was the age crime curve graph, right? So we've got our graph here, and the age crime curve goes like this. Spikes around 18 to 23, depending on if we're talking violent or property crime, and then it dips off. And once a person's about 35, the chances of them committing a serious crime is fairly small. And so this is something that's true not only in the United States, but in all the other countries as well. And not just today, but throughout history as well. This is kind of one of the many facts that we have in criminology. Well, we noticed this, and some people came up with an idea. And they said, if we can just take these people when they're committing that crime, about 18 to 23, and especially if we can find those real repeat offenders, those chronic offenders. Now, remember, the vast majority of crime is committed by a very small proportion of people, right? There's a clustering effect. So if we can find who those chronic repeat offenders are, if we can house them in prison until they age out of crime, so we catch them when they're in their early 20s, we hold them for about 10 years. Remember our age crime curve? Well, then once they get released, then they're likely not going to commit any more crime. Now, this philosophy is no doubt one of the reasons that we have our incarceration epidemic here in the United States. Now, that philosophy on paper looks very good, however in practice it doesn't work out nearly as well. And why? Why doesn't that work out the way that we thought it would, and the way that it looks like it should work on paper? Well, the reason why is kind of narrowing in on and only catching those repeat offenders we have found is extremely difficult, right? We like to think that we can predict and that we can just select those chronic repeat offenders, but that has proven to be a lot more difficult than we thought it would be. We are absolutely terrible at predicting and narrowing in on those repeat chronic offenders. And also, think about the ethics of holding someone like that, just waiting for them to age out of crime. Do you see any problems with housing, holding, and punishing someone for crimes we think that they are going to predict in the future? Yeah, I can see some problems with that as well. Our next one is rehabilitation. Now, rehabilitation was a huge sentencing philosophy in the United States from about 1950 to 1960. In the early 1970s, it very much went out of disfavor, and it's just finally starting to come back. So, why did rehabilitation sort of, wasn't favored anymore? What exactly happened? Well, basically, there are two things that happened. One, there was a very famous report published on the efficacy or how effective rehabilitation is. And that report was written by a gentleman named Martinson, and he did a study on kind of all the different ways that we go about rehabilitating people. And his very famous conclusion from that study is that really nothing works in terms of rehabilitation. Now, that's his very famous finding. There was another finding as well, though. And this finding is not articulated as often by social scientists because it makes us look like morons. Another important finding, again, that we don't articulate that much because it makes us look bad is that, even if something did work, the statistics and methods are so bad in the social sciences, we wouldn't even be able to tell that something works. So after that was our first reason. But the second reason was there was a real crime spike in 1963. Now, in a criminology class, hopefully you'll pick up the reason why there was a big crime spike. But for our purposes, all we need to know is that there was a huge crime spike in 1963. So people noticed this, and they said to the government, you should do something. Well, the government realized that in terms of deterrence, when we talk about kind of deterrence and how it sort of works, it's based upon the swiftness, it's based upon certainty, and it's based upon the severity of the punishment, right? Now, which one of those can we really manipulate? Can we manipulate how quickly we process people through the system? Maybe slightly, but we do have due process that we have to follow, right? It's one of the ground rules here in the United States that we can't violate, so we can't really make that much quicker. Now, can we influence the certainty that somebody gets caught? I mean, hypothetically speaking, we could. We could put a police officer on every street corner, and I have no doubt that that would increase the certainty. But, how realistic is that? That's not very realistic. And so the amount of police officers we would have to put on the streets in order to increase the certainty that somebody is caught is really not very realistic. And even if we did do that, that would probably just push, and there is a large amount of crime that happens behind closed doors, right, in people's homes where the police can't see. Now, what about the severity? Can we manipulate that one? Yes, we can. And yes, we did. and that's another thing that led to our incarceration epidemic here in the United States. So the United States holds 5% of the world's population, but we hold 25% of the number of people incarcerated in the world. So we do have 2.2 million people currently incarcerated. That's like 717 per 100,000. That is definitely the largest amount of people incarcerated in the Western industrialized nations. We're definitely the most punitive Western industrialized nation as well. And we can compare us to like Russia. Russia, they're definitely pretty hardcore on their prisoners there. But if you look at the number of people they incarcerate per 100,000, I think it's around 500. If you look at all the other kind of similarly situated nations like France, Spain, Italy, they're usually around like 100 people per 100,000. So you can see how many people we incarcerate here in the United States, and I'll quite frequently have people say, and I'm sure all of you hear it as well, about how we're soft on crime here in the United States. And if you look at the facts, I mean, that is just not true at all. Now, the number of people we incarcerate is finally kind of going on the downslope, but we are sort of just starting on the downslope. So rehabilitation went out of favor because of the Martinson Nothing Works report, and because crime spiked in 1963, people wanted the government to do something about it, and the government manipulated that one key factor in deterrence that it could, and it increased the severity of punishments, but it had obvious drastic consequences. Now, we do have a number of ways that we can go about rehabilitating people, and I think I mentioned a lot of those when we covered that in Chapter 3. Now, the best way that we know to go about rehabilitating offenders is cognitive behavioral therapy, or you could say CBT to be hardcore. And cognitive behavioral therapy basically goes off of the idea that people kind of tend to sometimes think incorrectly. Right? They get these schemas, or what we refer to them in psychology. Those are essentially kind of shortcuts and different ways that people think. And cognitive behavioral therapy attempts to change the way that people think. So let me just give you one example. In cognitive behavioral therapy, there's something called catastrophizing. And so some people tend to catastrophize. And that essentially just means that they always think that whatever they're experiencing, something bad is going to happen. So whenever you go in to take an exam, someone who catastrophizes, they're always going to fail the exam, which is going to lead to them failing the class, which is going to lead to them not getting a degree, which is going to lead to them, living in poverty for the rest of their life, and then eventually becoming an alcoholic. So you can see how from that one little circumstance, they have completely catastrophized that. So cognitive behavioral therapy will train that person, in a sense, to kind of think better, to think in a more positive way, to help them recognize when they are catastrophizing. Or another thing we'll talk about is like black and white thinking, right? There's no shades of gray, everything's just painted in black and white. But essentially take those different schemas and attempt to retrain them to think in a more positive and a better way. So cognitive behavioral therapy is by far the best way that we know to go about rehabilitating offenders, but it's expensive, it's time consuming. We definitely need people qualified to do it, not just some hack with a bachelor's degree, right? We need qualified individuals who can spend time, and all of that also equals money as well. And we have a lot of ways that we know that do not rehabilitate offenders, like boot camps, like life skills training, like, I'm trying to think of others. I think that's all that's coming off the top of my head right now, but I think you probably get the idea. So we talked about incapacitation, we talked about rehabilitation, we talked about deterrence. I don't think I'm going to talk about restorative justice for time purposes. So why do we essentially and primarily punish in the United States using incarceration, using jails and prisons? It's not how it always was. Now, jails and prisons have kind of always been around, but they haven't always been the primary way that we go about kind of punishing people. A long time ago, we would essentially banish people to other nations, to other states, so we could ship everyone to Canada. We did ship a lot of offenders to Australia, as you probably know, but you know, today Canada and Mexico and Australia might be a little ticked off if we just kind of sent them all of our offenders. You know, also clearly harsh physical punishment, especially harsh public punishment, right? So sometimes we would like nail people's ears to poles in the center of town, and public floggings, clearly public hangings and that type of stuff. But you know, we had the kind of Puritan period, we had Quakers, we had the Enlightenment with thinkers like Bentham and Locke and those types of people, and we kind of thought that that was a little derogatory. That was a little too bloodlust for us here in the United States. And a lot of those people, and many people, believed just that the fact that you are human sort of gives you a sliver of kind of divinity. Or as Kant would say, because you're a higher order, rationally thinking human being, there's some type of value in that, and you deserve some type of respect because of that. And so treating other human beings, treating other individuals like that, we found was just really not a good idea. And so one of the best ways that we found was to incarcerate people. Now again, even when we started to incarcerate, it was definitely harsh. The conditions were very poor. And especially, and if you take a corrections class, hopefully you would talk about this type of stuff. You could talk about like the reformatories, like the Elmira system, and they were originally referred to as reformatories. And these were very huge, very large, very prolific looking buildings that would be put kind of in the center of the town. And the reason why they were kind of these sort of prolific, sometimes sort of gothic, large looking buildings, sometimes it almost looked like tabernacles, that was to essentially kind of represent sort of the divinity of God and sort of the kind of power of the government. And so they were these very, very large buildings. And we would try to kind of instill a Protestant ethic in those types of people. And so we tried to kind of instill these middle-class Protestant values in them in these reformatories, but they were very harsh. And a lot of them, you couldn't talk at all. We brought a very famous individual over to the United States to kind of check out our reformatories, and he couldn't believe how there was not a word that was being said. But again, there were calls for change because people felt like that might be damaging to people. That might be a little bit too harsh on people, and the conditions in there were in fact very harsh. And keep in mind, when we send someone to prison, it's having their freedom taken away. It's having their liberty and freedom of movement taken away is the punishment. The goal is not to make their life the most miserable existence possible in there, right? It's the restriction and taking away their freedom of movement, and freedom to move and go about their business however they want. That is the punishment. So it's not to make their time in there to be the most miserable ever. Now they shouldn't, be having all the types of luxuries that everybody else has. Clearly there has to be some restrictions there, but the goal isn't to make it the most miserable existence possible. And generally speaking, it's not a fantastic existence in prison. So I know a lot of people in society think that, prison is just like this vacation away from home, but that definitely isn't the case, and I don't think that that should be the case. And I'll frequently have students who will bring up to me these exceptions that, well, you know, there's this one guy that I know, and he continues to go to prison because he's provided with 3 meals a day, and he gets TV, and no doubt there are a few of those, but again, those are definitely the exception and not the norm. And as one famous criminologist said, you know, if prison is such a fantastic place to be and it's so easy, why don't we throw open the gates? Throw open the doors to the prisons. Let's see how many people run out of the prison and leave, and let's see how many people go into the prison. And I think we all know what the answer to that question would be. Excuse me. All right. Looks like we are trucking along here good. Also, prisons are a bit on the expensive side. So we do spend about $82 billion a year in the United States on prisons. Out of the 3 criminal justice institutions, that's not quite the highest. We spend more on policing, but it is more than we spend on courts. The average cost to house an inmate in prison for 1 year ranges between about $25,000 to $35,000 a year. So it is definitely a pricey endeavor to engage in. When I'm in class, we have a fantastic discussion on shaming. For time purposes, unfortunately though, we're not going to have that discussion here. So what about Supermax prisons? Supermax prisons are designed to hold the proverbial worst of the worst, right? So we have people who can't be housed in regular prisons because they could possibly be too dangerous to the other inmates, could be too dangerous to the correctional officers, and so the argument is that we need somewhere to put the worst of the worst. And I can recognize that argument and respect that to a certain extent, but the problem is that we've taken and used Supermax prisons too much. And here we kind of have we refer to it as like the Field of Dreams phenomenon, right? Do you remember the famous phrase from the Field of Dreams movie? Right? If you build it, they will come, right? So it's very similar with the Supermax prison. So they were built to house the worst of the worst, but we found that there are beds, and we fill those beds up. So we feel like there has been too much of a essentially net widening effect, and people who really don't belong in those Supermax prisons are ending up in those Supermax prisons. And let me tell you, those Supermax prisons are miserable existences. And you can see on the PowerPoint and studies that have been done on the psychological effects that it has on people. As human beings, we are social animals. So no doubt you should be socially isolating right now, but that doesn't mean that you can't still socialize with people, right? You just have to keep a little bit of distance there. But as human beings, we do like to be around other people. And there are serious detrimental effects when we are isolated from other human beings. Also, Supermax prisons are very expensive. So I just said that a prison, it costs about $25,000 to $35,000 a year to house someone. Well, you can double that number for a Supermax prison. It costs about double, so we're talking about, $50,000 to about $70,000 a year to house someone in a Supermax prison. And generally speaking, they are in their cell for basically 24 hours a day under a closed circuit camera where they get watched in almost everything that they do. And like I said, you can read on the PowerPoint of the very detrimental effects that it has on people. And this is the part that I really want you to remember, though, about Supermax prisons. Keep in mind, of those 2.2 million people that we have incarcerated, how many of those people are eventually going to be released and have to integrate back into society? Is it 50%? Is it 70%? 80%? It's about 94% of those 2.2 million people are eventually going to be released. So keep that in mind. One of these people in a Supermax prison could eventually be your neighbor. And there are studies done of people who have been housed in Supermax prison and been released into the community from a Supermax prison. And this is in comparison to someone who's just in a regular state prison and then released into the community. And you know what we found in terms of recidivism? And what I mean by recidivism is someone who has been released from prison and then they reoffend and they get sent back. So our recidivism rate in the United States is about 67% of offenders will eventually return. And ironically speaking, once somebody has been sent to prison, it seems as if once they get released, there actually is a higher percentage that they are going to offend. So housing and keeping someone in prison actually has a synergistic effect and makes it more likely that they are going to offend. But we know those people who are released from a Supermax prison directly into the community, they have a higher recidivism rate. And the crimes that it appears that they commit do tend to be more on the violent side. So keep all that type of stuff in mind. Now, what about private prisons? Private prisons, I think, are absolutely repugnant and disgusting. And why do you think I would say that? Well, how do you feel about someone, for example, a company like the Corrections Corporation of America, that's sort of our biggest private prison company. How do you feel about a company like that making money off of incarcerating and housing prisoners? I think this idea of them making money for housing people is fairly unsavory and fairly disgusting. And I do think that there is something behind someone who commits a crime, gets into prison, and them being punished by the state. Right? They're housed in a state facility. The correctional officers who oversee them in their incarceration, they are state employees, they are state actors, they are state officials. And our philosophy behind like the social contract and all of that type of stuff that we talked about in terms of Hobbes, I think that there is something to that. And I think that there is something to that individual being incarcerated and punished by the state, by essentially all of us. And I think that is a loss when they are being incarcerated and punished by the Correction Corporation of America. And I think it's disgusting that they are able to make money off of people. But private prisons, there's definitely big money. It's about $3 billion a year. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of dirty money involved. There are a lot of politicians who are making money from these individuals, and it is fairly disgusting. But the argument that people hinge on for having private prisons is that they are cheaper. Right? The argument goes that anything the state can do, the private sector can do better and do it cheaper. Well, fortunately, the facts are in. We have a number of studies done on private prisons, and what have we found? We found the cost of a state prison versus a private prison is essentially the same. Now, we do have, I think it's about 8% of the incarceration population is housed in private prisons, and people are really finally starting to figure out how repugnant private prisons are. And I could see them disappearing here in the United States within 15 years, so we will see. Alright, so capital punishment. So hopefully you completed our assignment on capital punishment. You were supposed to read that article that I assigned you on capital punishment. So I'm not going to say a whole lot here on capital punishment. And I assume a lot of you will probably be in the capital punishment class that is being taught in the fall. And so you can take the death penalty down piece by piece. I taught the death penalty class once, and it was it was a good class. I think that can be a very good and very informative class. So as you can imagine, as the vast majority of criminologists are, I am very anti-death penalty. I think the fact that the United States still has the death penalty is, again, fairly repugnant and disgusting. And keep in mind about the company that we keep. So what about all the other Western industrialized nations out there? Do they have the death penalty? Does Russia? No. No. Canada? No. No, no, no. Italy? No, no Italy. And so you can see all of our kind of comparative friends in the world, they do not have the death penalty. Now, who's the death penalty king in the world? This can slightly come down to definitional issues, but the king of the death penalty is China, and the death penalty in China is fairly disgusting. In fact, there's like a, what's the word I'm looking for? Organ harvesting. And so they will take people out and just shoot them in the back of the head, essentially. And they have these vans that drive around as well that have curtains on them. And when you see one of these vans driving around, I mean, be careful. But they'll make sure they shoot them in the back of the head so they can harvest their organs and sell them on the black market. And that is not propaganda. Those are definitely the facts. But so what company are we keeping in the United States having the death penalty? Well, our company is China. Our company is Iraq. Our company is Iran. Our company is Afghanistan. Our company is North Korea. Now, what do you think about the land of the free and the home of the brave keeping that type of company? Now, fortunately, we don't kill nearly the amount of people that we used to. As of late, it seems like the number of people we kill a year has been averaging around like 50. It's been a while since we've reached around 100, so it is a lot lower than it used to be, and so that's good. And I'm of the firm belief, and typically in this class I'll do a pretty good deep dive into capital punishment. But I found that for the vast majority of people, once they become fully informed of the facts around capital punishment, they'll definitely be against it 9 times out of 10. And the one that I hear probably the most from my students is that, well, you know what, it just doesn't make sense to have the state pay to have somebody sit in prison for 50 years, and, you know, the state's just spending a lot of money doing that, and we should save the state money by just, you know, offing this person. Well, as my first indication, this person is very uninformed. And so we know it is by far more expensive to kill someone via capital punishment than it is to house them in prison for, say, 50 years. And I'm sure our book and I'm sure that article that I assigned you kind of ran those facts. The number one reason why I'm against capital punishment is that the chances of killing an innocent person are just way too high. And we know for sure that we have killed innocent people before. Now, what do we do when we find out we have killed an innocent person? Oops. Right? And, I mean, we've killed a number of innocent people that we know of before, but I think when I say that to my students, they think that I'm talking like back in like the 1940s or something. No. There was someone in the mid-90s that we're about 95% sure was actually quite innocent. And if you follow the Innocence Project at all, you know that those vast majority of people that they have gotten exonerated, and I think the number's up to around like 380 or something right now. These are people that we know for sure are innocent based upon DNA evidence. The vast majority of them were on death row. And so killing someone via capital punishment is just way too final. Now, I'm not opposed, philosophically speaking, against capital punishment. I mean, the state killing like someone who raped and murdered like an 8-year-old girl, that doesn't really bother me, but it's the practice of it. In practice, we just do it terribly in the United States. And again, the chances of us killing someone innocent is just way too high and not a risk that I personally am willing to take. So I have failed us miserably. I've been rambling now for 40 minutes. So I'm going to try to finish this out very quickly. So our book then goes into the correctional officer subculture. And as you can imagine, the correctional officer subculture is fairly similar to the police officer subculture. However, I think that there is a pervasive argument to be made that the correctional officer subculture is even stronger than the police officer subculture. Now, why do you think I would make that argument? What do you possibly think that it is about the correctional officer subculture that might make it stronger than the police officer subculture? Now, I don't have any facts or science to back this. This is just my personal opinion, but I think that there is a very pervasive argument here to be made about this. And I think the reason why the correctional officer subculture is even stronger than the police officer subculture is because there is a very clear and very well-defined us versus them in the correctional institutions, right? So yes, there's an us versus them in the police, but the police are still out interacting with regular, more upstanding citizens and people. But I mean, in that correctional institution, it is the correctional officers versus the inmates, and that is it. So because I think of that very clear and very well-defined us versus them, it creates that solidarity in corrections that I believe is even stronger than it is among police officers. And one of these days, I'm hoping somebody does a study on that, and if they don't, I may need to do that myself. But like I said, I mean, the characteristics of the correctional officer subculture are very, very similar to the police officer subculture. There is one that you might not be familiar with here on this list, and that is being a white hat. Now, being a white hat is essentially just showing sympathy towards the inmates, and so you never want to be a white hat. You never want to be sympathetic towards the inmates because your fellow correctional officers will not respond very kindly to that. And I've got some great examples and some other things that we'll talk about in terms of the correctional officer subculture and kind of what exactly it is like to work in a prison and to work in a jail and all that type of good stuff. I remember I took the kind of behind-the-scenes tour of the state prison in Utah. And Utah has a very famous sort of capital punishment and death penalty because Utah was one of the last states where they could use the firing squad. And I remember I was in there and I saw the chair and I sat in the chair that they strap people in when they would shoot them. And it was this metal chair, and I think you can find a picture of it online if you just want to Google the Utah State Prison. And I remember it was a chair, and it was kind of made of this metal mesh, kind of like lattice, if you're familiar with lattice. And I remember that there was a drain at the very bottom of it, a drain that was, you know, obviously sloped, so once the blood comes out of the individual, it would go into this drain and then drain off down into the sewer system. When I took this behind-the-scenes tour, I was a young psychology student, and so I sat in that chair, and I thought that it was kind of an interesting experience. I didn't really think much of it. Looking back now, I don't think I would sit in that chair anymore. But hopefully you enjoyed that experience reading that article on capital punishment. And if that is a topic you are interested in, then I would take the capital punishment class that we are offering in the fall. So I am way over time now, so I'm going to end you with some outro music. And I did bring up a song during our lecture, which isn't something I do very often, but I figured our outro music should be that song. So I will be in contact with all of you, and I will see you later.